Welcome to the Hard-Won Wisdom Podcast with best-selling author Fawn Germer and corporate innovator Michelle Brigman. Come here weekly for career and life-changing conversations with some of today's most influential thought leaders, senior executives, and trailblazers who will share their mentoring wisdom. This podcast is brought to you by the Women's Leadership Network.
Hi everybody, Fawn and Michelle here, and we cannot wait for you to spend a little bit of time today with Wendy Pearl, who's had the most amazing career as the point person / publicist for the Country Music Association.
Her story is amazing. You know, it's so inspiring to hear what that kind of passion can lead to. So I think it's time for you to meet Wendy.
Hi, I'm Wendy Pearl. I'm the owner of Wendy Pearl Public Relations, and I've had a career that has taken me from the Miami Herald to Nashville.
And I'm Fawn Germer.
And I'm Michelle Brigman.
So this is Hard-Won Wisdom, and Wendy has just totally minimized what she is, but she's a really big deal. She was a reporter when I was way back in working at the Miami Herald, and she had a moment that led her into the inner sanctum of country music. And so she's got great stories, but it really starts with the moment where she was able to say the words to our horrible bosses that every one of us dreamed of saying, which would be,
take this job and shove it. Thank you, John Paycheck.
That's right.
We've all wanted to have that moment. Yay, Wendy.
I mean, just
Got it.
And if our listeners even knew why we really wanted to say that so badly, there were a few nightmares there, but she got to do it. So Wendy, just tell us the story. How did you wind up in Nashville? And tell us this great tale that's going to have lots of gossip and celebrities and intrigue and all of that stuff.
You know what? It was a Miami Herald assignment. Honestly, I was writing a story about country culture in Davie, Florida, which had very much a cattle background, orange groves out in, what was then, on the edge of being undeveloped. And I was writing stories about the country music lifestyle and how to dress like a country music enthusiast down to like what kind of dog you needed to have. And it was the cover of Neighbors magazine. I had a lot of fun writing it, but in doing it, I really enjoyed the music. Like I really enjoyed the storytelling because as a writer, I was just drawn to the stories that I was hearing in the music I was listening to. And then I had an opportunity to do a travel piece and go to Nashville. And I went to Nashville, went to the Grand Ole Opry, spent some time going to the Bluebird Cafe, things that are iconic now, at the time, not as well known. And I just fell in love with Nashville as a community. And it was one of those trips where I was like, hey, I could, and I'm sure you've done it too, Fawn, where like, I could live here. You visit someplace and you feel immediately at ease. And I thought, you know what, if an opportunity ever presented itself here, I would look at it because this is a place I could live. And I felt at home. And sure enough, somebody that I had worked with when I was at the University of Miami was the head of the PR department at Sony Music in Nashville, which had Columbia and Epic Records. And she couldn't find a publicist who could write. That publicists at that point in school were being taught basic PR techniques, but they weren't writers. And so much of what, what they wanted to do was about story, if the format was about storytelling, they didn't have anybody in those positions who were telling stories. And so she called me and said, would you ever consider leaving the Miami Herald and coming up here and being a publicist? And it was just, the right time in my career. I was single. I could easily move and I jumped at it. And then I got to say those famous lines. So like, it was worth leaving all that in of itself.
Absolutely. So then what happened?
Well, I got to Nashville and started working literally. It was in February and I came from South Florida, and February in Nashville is kind of unpredictable weather, but usually you'll get a pretty severe snow and ice storm. And I had no clothes. I had like foofy, kind of gypsy, newsroom dress.
Right.
You didn't dress. You just, you wherever you went. And so like I got there, literally there was a box and everybody had to put like sweaters and coats in this box for me and gloves and in scarves because I was going to freeze to death my first week. And so I got my box when I, went to the office and immediately made friends with people that were working there who were looking after me and making sure that I didn't freeze to death, and started work. And back then, PR was, we were making it up as we went. It was the early 90s. Everything was starting to click in terms of that particular class of, artists that were really resonating across the country. So you had Garth Brooks, you had Alan Jackson, you had Clint Black, you had people who were really making a difference. And at that time, SoundScan had gone, people had gone from not really fully understanding how many country records were sold, because people who were collecting that data were calling a record store and saying, who sold the most records this week? And the person on the phone would be like, they would say however many records were sold for their favorite act. 9 times out of 10, that was going to be a pop artist. And they just kind of overlooked what was happening in the country space until SoundScan kicked in. And all of a sudden you had hard data and numbers on how much country music was being sold. And it changed everything, because then people realized how much of a business it had become, how much money could be made. It was clearly before all of the changes that happened as a result of downloads and streaming and what we have today. And it was a vibrant, vital time to be in the industry. And I got in right as that was happening. On the ground floor, I was a secretary. I cut my salary in half when I left the Miami Herald in order to take this job, and worked my way up and ended up at Sony for 2 years at Sony. And then I went to another small startup record label called Asylum Records, and then went on from there.
To the peak was at?
I had my incarnations from, Sony to Asylum. I went to TNN before it became Spike. And now, so it was the Nashville Network. And that was all lifestyle, cool, kind of quirky programming. So I was in TV at that point. So I was doing the Waltons and the Dukes of Hazzard, and TNN had a music award show that was fan based, but they also had NASCAR and outdoors and fishing shows and that kind of stuff. And so I worked at TNN for a couple of years. And then when they became Spike, all of that programming started migrating away from country lifestyle to roller jam and rock and bowl and things that were very not in the country space at all, and not my wheelhouse. And there was a job open at the Country Music Association for the head of their PR department. And I applied for that job. And I'll never forget, this is the hardest job I ever got, but it took 17 interviews for me to get that job. I know, I can't even explain the number of people I talked to on multiple occasions, but the way I am sure I got that job was, there was a board member, Irby Simpkins, who happened to be the publisher of the Nashville paper. And Irby was on the committee to find this person who was going to fill this role. And I think he had a soft spot for me because I was a journalist, and not many PR professionals at that point were former journalists. And so we had a lot in common. And I believe, without a doubt, that he hired me because he knew I would be an observer, that he knew I would be the person who would be the watchful observer of the format, that I would be the one then to tell the stories in real time, to take care of the legacy, to ensure how it was being presented and moving it forward. And I feel like that is the reason I got that job, is that he knew I wasn't there to become a celebrity myself. I wasn't there to insert myself into a story, because God knows when we were at the Herald, that was like tantamount to catastrophe.
Right. Yeah.
So I was very comfortable in that role. I was very comfortable just watching and being the caretaker of what that story would end up being at a time that was incredibly challenging and life-changing.
So I have a couple of questions on this, because I think about women today and some of the challenges that they're faced with. And few things. One, I don't want to lose sight of the fact that you took a position, you said, that was half of what you were making before.
Yeah.
So women think, well, I can't do that. That's failure. I'm taking steps backwards. I mean, what advice would you give in terms of just weighing some decisions like that, to say that, sometimes you do take steps back to move forward?
It's about passion. It's about following your passion. And if you clearly care about what that job is, and you know it's where you can make a difference, you will make sacrifices, because eventually then the money will catch up. And that's what happened to me. Like literally, when I left the Miami Herald, I was making $35,000 a year, and I ended up making 18,000, like just under $18,000 as a coordinator at a record label. And within 2 years, I became a manager, and then got my first job as a manager that became a director position at another record label. And then when I went to TNN, I became a director of that particular department. And then when I went to CMA, I came in as a director, but then eventually became a vice president and remained a vice president until I left. And then recently I worked again for Sony Music for a year, where I was a vice president once more. So if you follow your passion, the money will follow you. Like I've seen it happen over and over again with people who make decisions based on where they know they need to be.
Have you kept that passion with country music? And then how much of a part of your life is the music actually to you?
You know what? I do. And I was afraid at first that it was going to be, if it became my work, I wouldn't enjoy it anymore. But even this last year has meant so much to me, and so much, like in terms of, I haven't been around live music, obviously, because the whole industry shut down in that area, but listening to music and getting comfort from music. And I found what I kept doing is I kept going back to the 90s. Some of the, I was very nostalgic this past year, and going back and kind of revisiting music that really mattered to me very early on in my career that I got reconnected to, because you get caught up in the grind and what's happening, what's being played today. But I really spent a lot of time going back and looking at things again. And that's been fun. So I feel honestly, this past year has really inspired me in a way that I haven't been probably a few years up until now.
They say there's a book coming out which is going to really highlight some of the sexism in the industry. And I want to know if you experienced some of that, and then kind of contrast that with the fact that here is this industry which had unbelievably successful women writing powerful, edgy stories. It's like, when you see things that Loretta Lynn wrote, right. I mean, these are groundbreaking, great women, strong women, but I guess the industry had issues, huh?
It's, you know what? I thought about this quite a bit, and the industry had hugely successful, influential women leaders very early on. You had Frances Preston, who is with BMI. You had Donna Hilley, major female publisher in town. You had Connie Bradley, who was in charge of ASCAP, which is another one of the performance rights organizations, and Joe Walker-Metter, who not only was the first, she started as the Gal Friday, who ended up running and becoming the executive director of the Country Music Association and what would become the Country Music Hall of Fame and Foundation. So you had, I think it was at a time where the music industry in New York and LA, primarily New York, didn't really care about what was happening in Nashville. So they would kind of let the girls run that. It was kind of what I thought was the mistake they made, because when they put the girls in those positions, they thrived. They dominated. They were running things in this town in a way that hadn't been done before, because they were organizers. They were compassionate caregivers of the art and the artist and the songwriters, and caretaking, again, the music in a way that I think if men had been running the town at that point in time, it would have been very different. And so when they were there, that became the legacy that female executives would then aspire to. So we had role models, where other industries never had females that were role models. Country music did. And I think we really benefited from that. And you'll see today that there are females in important positions, not enough as far as I'm concerned. And certainly we could use more of a female voice, because that's where our format's main audience is. And I think we kind of lose sight of that some days, but it was really about those women, those pioneering women, making it possible for me and other female executives to achieve what we've achieved today, in spite of it being a male-dominated industry on the other coasts. Nashville was a pocket that was left alone and able to thrive under female leadership.
Were you seeing a lot of those women bringing other women up through the ranks as well?
Oh, yeah. I had the good fortune of knowing and working with all of those ladies. And they were the steel magnolias, they were the ones in a room that, they would kind of take you under their wing and like, oh, honey, let me tell you, it was all very, there was a camaraderie. There was an understanding that when they recognized in another female executive something that they admired or respected, they would take you under their wing and give you their best advice. And not that they would tell you what, they were never like directing. I never got a sense of them as directing people, but gently guiding. And that made a difference for me.
What about with the performers? Did they have competitive issues, or were they doing the same thing of propelling each other forward and mentoring each other?
I think it was a case-by-case basis. You get, like people forget that artists are people, they have a huge platform and people feel like they know them through their art, but they're at the end of the day people. And some of them are very, very competitive. And when you're racing a song up the chart and you're trying both of you to get to number one, and somebody has more ads in a given week and somebody is, not achieving as fast, airplay as fast as somebody else is, it's a competition. And I know some people watch those things closely and want to succeed. And then you've got other situations where you get people who are just wanting to bring everybody along. And I think you see that more on the touring side, where you've got artists who have been incredibly successful, selling out venues, looking at really helping artists who need a leg up and access to a bigger audience, giving them opening slots on tours so that they can go out, sure, it's the first 30 minutes and people are still getting their beer and, getting settled into their seats, but they're part of a tour where they have access to an audience that will likely, depending on who gets booked, respond to their music in a positive way. And so you see a lot of that where they're really supporting young acts by bringing them on the road and helping them there. Most of the time, because we're a very tour heavy industry, artists don't have opportunities to be together very often. And when that happens, it's usually around award shows because they're living very separate lives on tour buses all over the country. So, even though Nashville is the center for the industry, the artists aren't always, when the industry operates the way it normally does, it's usually on the road somewhere. So you don't get those kind of collaborative moments. But where we are really collaborative also, besides on the touring side, is the songwriting community. Like you'll have songwriters like every day in Nashville, up and down Music Row, in writing rooms, composing songs with other songwriters, and songwriters will go on the road to write with artists on their tour bus while they're, since they're not in town. So like they do get involved in that part of the process, but the actual songwriting community that's here that aren't necessarily touring are always together, always inspiring each other, always collaborating.
It's pretty inspiring just to hear about that.
Yeah, it's cool.
Who are the nicest ones?
Oh, they're all nice in my book, Fawn.
Yeah, I know. That's what you're supposed to say, but come on. I'll give you a quarter.
What, call someone who cares.
Oh, give you a surprise.
You know what? I'm thinking, this is my thinking face. Because I cannot remember very often people just not being kind. I think, and the reason for that is that unlike other formats of music, in country music, when people are on, and by on, I mean they're doing interviews or they're at an event or they're at a concert or wherever, they're at work. And they know that in order that the history of this format is that people have connections to people and that it's relationship based, not just within the industry, but with the fans. And so somebody who's kind of a jerk doesn't last, because if they can't even maintain a modicum of respect and kindness, it's so easily seen and transparent, they don't really stick around very long. And so it's really, it does kind of weed itself out by virtue of being authentic.
A friend of mine, he wrote a really good book, business book, but it was called Think Like a Rock. It was Rock Star. I'm thinking maybe he needs to change it to Think Like a Country Star. But it was talked about fandom and how building authentic relationships, right? That you, it's like an extension of your family, right? The the names that you may have for your fans, they form a community amongst themselves. And so I'm even curious, and going back to the comment you made around planning some of the awards, how much thought was put into ways to create that community then with the artists as well as the fans on TV who are going to watch or maybe in the stands? Like, how did you think about creating a place for both of them to feel really connected and part of what was happening at those events? Because that's a lot of
It's a
people
lot.
to satisfy, right?
There's this great event that happens in Nashville, and it started in, oh my gosh, in 73, I believe. CMA created it. And it's called Fanfare. Now it's CMA Fest, and it takes over downtown Nashville 4 days every year in June. But it initially happened because all of these fans were showing up at the radio DJ convention. And the radio DJ convention was really important for artists because they were trying to get these radio guys to play their latest song or get to know them so that when they put out the next song, they would play it. And so there was a lot of business that happened around those early radio conventions, and fans found out about it, that the artists were there and they were showing up, and they were showing up to meet the art, to meet the artists that were coming in. And so they would line up and they would be there for their autographs. And what happened is it turned out that CMA saw that this is an opportunity, and they created this event where fans would come. And they initially took over the municipal auditorium, but eventually it worked to the Tennessee State Fairgrounds. And they would literally take over like the swine barn and the cow shed. And these artists would set up a table and a booth, and they would sign autographs and take pictures and meet fans for hours on end. And then there would be concerts. There was a racetrack in the center of the fairgrounds that they used for drag racing. And they would set up a stage and they'd have concerts every night. And just one example of how that changed my impression of fans is Garth. It was the first year I was working at CMA. It was 2000. And Garth Brooks came and signed autographs at the fairgrounds for 23 straight hours.
Oh my God.
Didn't take a break, didn't eat, didn't go to the bathroom that anybody knows about. And he, till the last person got an autograph, he stayed there. And and CMA had security that they kept going, so that that kept the lights on, so that people could stay in line. But if you were in line, you got to meet Garth Brooks. And that kind of dedication and commitment to fans, when I was at the record labels, we used to have label booths where our artists would come in and sign, and I would be the one holding cameras, taking pictures, holding babies, and getting people through the line. And it's where I figured out more than any other experience that I've ever had in this industry, the connection between an artist and a fan is so it's just cemented in the music, and in ways that you can't pull them apart. Like, they are just woven. And so you have people who were coming and crying at the face of meeting somebody that had been so important to them, whether it was a song or a piece of music that was connected to a moment in time that mattered to them. There was some pivotal point in their life that music connected, and they had to be there to tell that artist what that meant to them. And literally tears, it was like their Christmas. And people would come to this event from every state and 23 foreign countries, and they would camp out and just meet artists. And then when it moved downtown, in like the beginning of the 2000, I think it did, it went out of the fairgrounds, which were quaint but run down. And I mean, air conditioning the swine barn was a challenge all in itself. And so moved downtown into these beautiful facilities, and it still continued to grow. You get like 70 to 100,000 people a day taking over downtown Nashville, again, from all over the world, because that still matters. Like, here's something that's been going on for 45 years that means as much today as it did when they were at the fairgrounds. And so when you talk about that connection, I've seen it. And those people have paid my salary all of these years. They are the ones that drive this entire mechanism. And it is driven on passion. It is driven on connection, and it's driven on the access they have to artists who are willing to sit in those hot ass booths, signing autographs over and over and over again. because it's the legacy.
You said something interesting about how the ones who had the attitude or the ego don't last.
Yeah. No.
But that's certainly not the case in Hollywood or in rock and roll.
Right.
So this is just, these are different kinds of fans.
They're different kind of, they're very invested, very, very invested. And if it's not authentic, it's very easy to weed it out or to see it.
So did that impact you as a leader to see how to deal with people from what you were witnessing there?
Because when I was at CMA, I was surrounded and working with artists all the time, but CMA didn't represent artists. So I didn't have that one-on-one connection with them. So the only context I saw them in was the award show or CMA Fest or songwriters events and things like that we did. And what I saw over and over again is that, everybody knows very quickly, it's a very small town. Whole Music Row is like literally within 16 square blocks is the entire industry of Nashville, maybe much smaller now. So it's very hard to hide somebody whose intentions are not pure. And I think you see it, the easiest place for you to see it is when you've seen artists from other formats try and migrate into country music to make their country record. And there have been artists that it's worked, like Darius Rucker has had enormous success migrating from Hootie into country music and doing what he's done there. It's been, you find artists who have been successful, but there have been a lot of artists that haven't, that just think that country is an easy, they come in and they think it's easy to make a country record. And it is, you can record a country record, but unless you are authentic to that format in your heart, the fans won't embrace it.
Okay. So what were the Cinderella moments where you thought, I cannot believe I'm here?
I get to do this for a living. There've been so many of them and I still get them. I still get really goosebumpy because I love what I do every single day. I'm trying to think of where the first one happened. Anytime I'm in the Ryman, anytime I'm in the Grand Ole Opry and see somebody on that stage and the circle that's in the center of that stage is from the original Ryman, that's meaningful because I'm always connected to legacy and history and understanding how we got here as a format. So anything that touches that piece of little sacred stage matters to me. So, and especially when it's a new artist and somebody who's playing it for the first time, although people who've played it a million times still get just as emotional about it. But that for me has anything in the Opry is one of those things that just matters.
So you mentioned earlier some of the 90s music, just some of that really connected with your heart. Who are some of those? What are some of those songs or who are some of those artists that just get you?
Oh, well, when I was at Sony early on, it was Doug Stone and Colin Ray and Mary Chapin Carpenter. And I mean, Waylon was there. And one of my favorite things with Waylon while he was on the label was we did a radio interview with him and James Hetfield from Metallica. And I know we were talking about, where people if people didn't have an authentic connection to the format, James Hetfield did. He really appreciated and revered what Waylon represented. So you had these kind of two outlaw music figures talking to each other about music and their journey from completely different generations and formats. But again, authenticity, going back to where they connected was in their absolute desire to do something different and communicate who they were as artists. So, that was probably, one of those moments too that I geek out over all the time. But that's where I was like completely. And then when I went on to Asylum, the roster there was a little bit more eclectic. So that was Emmylou Harris and Brother Phelps and Brian White and Kevin Sharp and those artists that, were just artistically making, Guy Clark too, obviously, making incredible music at a time. I was always really fortunate to be like right in the sweet spot when something was changing. And in Nashville, as country music was getting popular, people were seeing the profit that could be made there. And what became commercial country music was dominating radio. You had a format that was starting to emerge that didn't kind of play by those rules, and it was falling into the Americana mindset. So all the art, many of the artists that I was working with at Asylum would become very regularly featured on Americana radio. And at the time, you didn't even recognize it yet because it wasn't something that was really fully blossomed. I mean, it was out there. There was a chart. And it was funny because Guy Clark had his first #1 on the Americana chart, and we made giant plaques and gave them to everybody. And it was like, you never forget your first time. And it's true because he'd been making music forever, but here was his first #1 on this new chart that was really starting to take off. So that was probably what I got out of that experience more than anything else, was how music finds its way and it finds its voice and it finds its platform and it finds its audience.
There's just so many great musicians, and it's interesting how it speaks to the point too you made earlier, just speaks to these certain moments in your life where no matter what, you're going to reconnect to those songs, and they never, they never get old.
It does seem like artists see their songs as their children.
Yes.
And that the amount of prolific songwriters, though, it's like how many thousands of songs has Willie Nelson and Dolly Parton and Loretta Lynn written?
Yeah. And those are just because you know those people and you know their catalog and their work. There are songwriters every day grinding out songs, and it's their business, and they go into these writers' rooms in their publishing companies and they write 3 songs a day, 5 days a week. And that doesn't even count for like where they're when they're out getting inspiration or where those ideas are coming from. So it's, and then you whittle that down to the number of artists that get signed and who you can pitch those songs to, and artists who are also writing their own music. So they may already have songs that they want to record. So they're not looking at songs by outside writers necessarily. Some of them are. It's outstanding when a song breaks through. It just doesn't happen that often when you have that kind of volume created and stacked up against you on the front end. It's hard.
So what is it? Like, what is it that makes that song break through? Is there, that you've seen, obviously that's a $64 million question, right? But but like, what have you seen? Because it's more than you hear, like it's got to have the it factor, or is it the connection? Is it the melody? Is it like, what are the things that make the magic happen?
God, like you said, if I knew, I would not be a publicist. I'd be running a record label. There's some secret sauce that somebody knows the recipe to, and I don't, where it's just something hooky, like there's a hook, or there's the bridge or a piece of the melody that just sticks in your brain. You cannot get rid of it. It stays with you. You want to hear it again and again. And the mechanism in place to help you hear it again and again traditionally had been country radio. And so how many plays and when those plays were happening so that you would actually keep hearing it and it would continue to get in, ear candy and stuck in there. So it's like all of those things that come together. And then there's a tour that's coming through your market, and all of a sudden you're going back out and seeing, because now you've heard the song and, oh my God, I've got to see them live. And then you've seen them live and you bought a t-shirt or, and now like you're really invested, and it becomes this thing that feeds itself. It's a giant hungry beast.
Well, and it just seems so different with the country songs than you hear in pop, because if I listen to a pop song, which, my daughter, my youngest, right, I'm going to hear the same thing repeated 1,000 times. Whereas I can go listen to just these country songs that, which is my preference, is there's this story. I walk away, there's a moral, there's a lesson. It's a teaching moment. It's not just, say whatever rhymes. And I think that's part of what makes country music different and hard for, you're talking about some of those crossover artists. You can't just walk in there and have a good tune. There's got to be a point.
Exactly. No, I think you really hit that's what sets it up. It's the stories. This is a storytelling format, and it's with real artists playing real instruments, real musicians, and the musicians are as revered as the singers. Like, it's like every part of this community kind of bolsters every other part. Like the artists are only as good as the musicians that they have playing with them. And so you've got these cultures of like studio musicians and touring musicians, and and the songwriters who are contributing their songs, and also writing with the artist, and where that art is coming from. And then I didn't get into producers and engineers, but it's really all about bolstering the music. And it was, Harlan Howard had this, it's 3 chords and the truth, and it really boils down to that. That's really what country music is.
Wow. So 3 chords and the truth. How much truth was there in the show Nashville?
Enough to keep people watching it every week.
Did you watch it every week?
I did, because I knew people. And so I went like, that had cameos. That was my favorite part of it, is that there were several cameos that they would use people in the industry for. And so it was like watching home movies, where you would see people. And it was just, here's what I think it was. I think they took pieces of the truth and embellished them in a way that Hollywood will do. But the struggles and the kind of thing that made it high drama and very much, appealing. It had at the height of it, it was being played in 35 different countries.
Oh my God.
And so the people that were being like in love with that show were coming to Nashville in droves. And it was at a point in time where the tourism industry skyrocketed. So you had places in the show like the Bluebird Cafe, which is a real place. And people always lined up for the Bluebird anyway, but this became insane, like around the parking lot lined up, because they had seen it on Nashville and they wanted to see it in real life. And there became this whole cottage industry of like Nashville locations and the houses and the buildings that were, part of the show that people would come here and want to see because they wanted to touch it. They wanted to feel part of it. But what happened is people were coming to visit because they had fallen in love with the show on TV, got here and fell in love with Nashville as a community. And so tourism in this town, I think as a result of that show, just skyrocketed. So you have all of these crazy honky tonks down on Broadway opening up and music playing downtown. Like we've just magnified, we went from a handful of clubs to dozens of clubs all playing music. And it was great because it gave those musicians an opportunity and a place to perform. But it was life-changing for this town, definitely.
I love how in every corner of Nashville, you get off the plane and there are performers singing their country music in the airport. And then, so it's, I love that. And I did want to ask you about the conservative assumptions about country music. So how does that play out, and how does that impact how you do your job?
It's a great question. And I feel like the industry itself, a lot of people that are part of the country music industry didn't grow up here. They're not necessarily from Nashville. Like I'm from South Florida. People that I've worked with have come from New York and LA and Ohio and all points, throughout the entire country, because they were coming here for the music. So songwriters that were coming here, technical people that were coming here, artists that were coming here that, from all over. So you have this real unusual melting pot within the community. And the community itself tends to lean very, not very, but more liberal than the regular audience or regular population of the state. As a matter of fact, they talk about it all the time that, you've got, it's a very red state with a very blue heart, where Nashville is, in terms of the voting, the way people vote within the state. Nashville is very much, liberal leaning. And I think that's because of all of the artistic community that's based here. But you also have a fan base that stretches from one coast to the other. So, it's really being mindful of where their values are and where the industry, and where the industry falls on those values as a storytelling industry, and how you reflect a moment in time, honestly. Because like we talked before, you can't not be honest about what you're seeing and what's going on and how that gets reflected in the music. And I think you had several artists this year kind of grappling with that. Mickey Guyton is a perfect example of somebody who's African-American who has taken her role as a female country artist and really told her story in a way that people have connected to her. And she's always been an enormous talent, but I think she's getting the attention now that she rightfully deserves because she's willing to use her voice to speak about her personal experience. And I think that's where country music has really excelled, is in the personal experience and not in a position where they're dictating to an audience what their experience should be.
So that's the difference between her and the Dixie Chicks.
Exactly. Where it's this is about my personal journey, my experience, my, how I feel in this moment, as opposed to you should feel da 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 da. Like I don't, as an observer, again, I'm just an observer, but as an observer, you don't see that very often, where you get people telling our audience how to feel.
That wouldn't go over very well.
It wouldn't go over well at all.
That audience.
You lay out what you see, and let people draw their own conclusions and opinions and feelings about it. And I think that's where we do a really good job, especially in the community.
What do you think of Michelle?
I know your squirrels rolling around in there.
Well, no, because I mean, so I think that I don't want to go down too far down this rabbit hole, but what I think is the beauty again of country music is the words are honest. The stories are honest. And I think that's why it can break through and cut across so many different people and experiences and demographics. And I think as long as it can stick to those stories and that truth and honesty, people, your traditional country music, and again, people are more apt to listen. I can listen to it whenever it is letting me relate to something I felt or experienced before. As soon as it becomes this is the way to go, this is the right answer. Being from a small town Texas girl, that is the last. Right. If you want to be heard, that is the absolute worst thing you can do.
And I think that you're absolutely correct. And I think that's where country music has really succeeded for generations. When we were talking about Waylon earlier, the songs that he was like, it was only from his personal experience and what his view, but you draw your own conclusions. And I think that's, probably we give that much credit to our fan base, where we don't need to tell them what to believe. We're going to let them make those decisions for themselves. And that might not mean that I always agree or we always agree, because we do not, but at least there's that level of respect. And I think you can have that level of respect when you have that level of communication on the front end in terms of those relationships.
So if you could time travel, because that industry has changed so much.
Yeah.
So what do you think were the real great moments for the industry that you would have loved to be a part of?
Oh, wow.
Porter Wagoner show.
No, what? There was, I can't remember who did it, but I wish I could. The first time country music was in Carnegie Hall. That to me would have been one of those, and it happened while I was at CMA. We moved the CMA Awards to New York in 2005 for 1 year. And it was probably the best thing that ever happened within the industry, because it gave direct access to the industry tastemakers in New York a vision of what country music really was, because they weren't coming to Nashville to see it yet. It was just kind of happening over there, and we weren't getting the attention that everybody felt that the format deserved. And so we were fine, we'll take it to you. And so we literally packed up the show, moved to New York, went to Madison Square Garden. But we had a week of events. I did 13 red carpets before I ever got to the CMA Awards red carpet in New York. And so we did events with Mayor Bloomberg, and we had events at Carnegie Hall, and we had, we took over we had a culinary day where we had all these crazy restaurants, in Southern cuisine. And it was a very much an immersive takeover of that city. And so you couldn't not know about country music that week. But going to Carnegie Hall as part of that event and realizing the first time a country artist was invited to perform on that stage was probably just hugely impactful. I think the first CMA Awards that was televised was, it was sponsored by Kraft, and and I can't imagine that could have been incredibly cool, because I've gone back and seen photos and TV clips of all of those very early shows, and you can see extension cords were on the set, like kind of hanging down. And so how the production value of those shows have changed to what it is today, and these gorgeous sets that we have. And being at the first fanfare, when those fans were lining up, like the first fanfare, fans didn't understand what it was. So it was in a municipal auditorium. I think they sold 5,000 tickets. They gave away 10,000 tickets just so that the artists felt like it wasn't a waste of their time. And they went to the local military base, and they gave those tickets away to those military base, families to come and hang out for the day. And so, and how those things have grown, like being there when they were born would be amazing to me, just because it's been so much of my career, following those stories from the point that I got involved to today. So being there at the beginning of some of those would have been awesome.
Yeah, but Wendy, you did a lot to help grow that.
Right.
A big part of that journey. So, you have been in the beginning and watching it to get to where it is, and then now being able to venture out on your own. So it's so exciting. I really appreciate you sharing these. I think one of the things I always like to do as we are coming to a close is just call out a few sort of hard wisdom. I know.
After show, don't worry.
Yeah,
You're not off the hook.
But we got a little hard-won wisdom nuggets here. So a couple of things really stood out. Number one, I think you exemplified this: follow your passion, right? Follow your passion, and all the good things are going to come along with it. But as long as you stick to what's true to you, that's going to be the most important thing. And then I think the other couple of themes were really highlighting the power of the story. So people are, whether you're in business, music, you've got to understand how to tell a great story and connect to that emotional level to the people that you are speaking with, because that right there is what can really build relationships and bring people together toward a common purpose. And I think that's something that can break through and help us, just generally our country, in a lot of ways. And then really going back to the fanfare piece, I think that what I think was cool about that is really tuning in and paying attention to the people you wanted to build relationship with and what was connecting. Instead of forcing something else, you paid attention to what was important to them, and you all came together and nurtured that and fed that. And what did you say? It went from 5,000 to now it's hundreds of thousands, of pre-COVID, of how many people show up to something like that. Those are the things in terms of meeting people where they are in a way that's meaningful to them, and building those relationships. And wow, what a great life so far you've had. I mean, just so many great experience. So I'm so appreciative that you came to share some of those with us today in our audience. So thank you so much, Wendy.
It has been joy and a pleasure. And just, I loved hanging out with you guys.
Oh my God. Well, I've always loved hanging out with you, girlfriend, but boy, I'm just so proud of you. And it's really very electric to hear you talk about all of this, because you just light up. You were meant to do that work.
Well, and it's an honor. It really is an honor, because it's like the CMA's, part of the CMA's role is to pick the people who go into the Country Music Hall of Fame every year. And I have been blessed to write the copy that has gone on those plaques that will hang in that rotunda forever. And so as a writer and as a storyteller, to be part of history, what can be better? What could be better than that? That's why we became journalists. That's why we follow those nuggets. And so that's where my joy comes from. And to be part of that, and to still be that observer that Herbie Simpkins hired, that meant, 20 years ago, means a lot to me.
I'm so proud and grateful. Thank you so much for being with us.
Absolutely.
Thank you for joining the Hard Won Wisdom podcast with best-selling author Fawn Germer and corporate innovator Michelle Brigman. Join us weekly for career and life-changing conversations with some of today's most influential thought leaders, senior executives, and trailblazers who will share their mentoring wisdom. This podcast is brought to you by the Women's Leadership Network. Visit hardwonwisdom.com for more on this podcast and for links to Fawn and Michelle's web pages and social media. Also, be sure to rate, subscribe, and review wherever you listen to your podcasts. We really appreciate that effort, and we'll see you next week.